right. Okay. All right. Hey, we're there. All right. Hopefully you didn't hear me mumbling to myself like a crazy person. Maybe you did. Okay, so welcome back. Happy Friday. I don't know if this is good news or bad news. I guess it depends if you're a glass half full, glass half empty type of person. Friday, this marks the end of our 7th week. So you are halfway to the end of the semester. So I don't know if you're like, oh my God, thank God we're halfway there. Or, oh my God, we're only halfway there. I guess that depends on, how things are going so far. But you've made it halfway. So that's, I think, good news. Okay, so today we're going to keep going on deviance and crime. Talking about, what we were talking about last time. Oh, well, then only know this. I teach 11 classes a year. So if you really, really want to find more classes with me, I have lots to choose from. No one has yet taken, I think the record for the most classes anyone has taken with me is 7 different courses. So, maybe if you love my class so much, you can go for the record. Although I teach a smaller variety than I used to, so maybe not. Okay. We're talking about crime rates, right? So we ended off last time talking about crime rates, both how they're reported, right? And we've got our kind of 3 main categories, right? Uniform crime reporting, self-report surveys, and victim surveys. And the kind of general trends, that starting in kind of the 1960s, crime started to go up. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, it peaked and it descended. And until really recently, right, it hadn't started to rise again, either in terms of total crime or severity. Now, basically since around 2013, 2014, crime has been rising a little bit again, though not nearly to the levels it was, in the 1980s. So we're still not quite back there. All right. So this is a kind of a long slide, I think. So bear with me. There's a bunch of explanations that have been sort of offered for why crime started to decline in the 1980s, right? All right. So some of them are kind of interesting. Some of them I think are a little bit weird. We'll go through them kind of in turn here. Okay, so one of them is that in response to the kind of crime, the building kind of wave of crime that was coming sort of from the 1960s to the 1980s, one of the kind of responses that the state, right, so, in Canada, but same in the US, the state came up with was to basically increase law enforcement and corrections to kind of try and mitigate the problem, right? So starting, really a little bit after the crime wave starts to really hit, right, say in the 1970s, one of the pushes that the state goes through is to substantially increase the number of law enforcement officers that are trained, right? So you train more police and correctional officers, right? So there's an expansion in the size and scope of the prison population, right? So more correctional officers, and then a subsequent kind of bureaucracy that manages people post-release, right? So the whole probation and parole system kind of gets built out from the 1970s. And so basically, what it means is if there's more police on the street, they're going to catch more people committing crimes, right? And so, basically at a certain point, crime, will shrink because there'll be so many officers on the street that people won't dare to commit crimes. And then you have a whole apparatus of corrections that's keeping a lot of people locked up who might commit crimes, so crime rate would go down, and a whole kind of post-parole system that tries to keep people in line. So the growth of that whole system actually, would have decreased crime over time. Now, there is some argument that's been made too that kind of the initial, the really steep growth, that you see if I go back a couple slides, right, in terms of crime, that really steep growth that happened sort of from the beginning of the 1970s might actually also be a reflection of the fact that there's more officers on the street, right? That as this kind of, before they put everybody in jail and people got used to the idea that there were police everywhere, this increased police presence would have meant there were more cops catching more criminals, right? And that will make it look like the crime rate actually, like there's more crime. Actually, police were just probably, or potentially, maybe not probably, catching more of the people who were committing crimes, right? But this, basically, and then at one point though, you basically get it so that people are aware of the police presence, and a lot of the people who were committing crimes have been locked up, and so they can't commit crimes anymore. Okay, so that's explanation number one. Right, so these are all kind of rival explanations. Explanation number two. One of the things we know, right, is that young men are the most prone to committing crime, right? And roughly the kind of age framework for criminals typically, if we look at the demographics, is the most crime is committed by young males aged somewhere between around 15 and around 22 years old. Before which, right, they're too young, and after which, it doesn't drop off a cliff, but they start to commit less and less crime over time, right? And so by the time by the time they're 40 years old, 40-year-old men commit far less crime than 20 or 18 or 19 or 15-year-old men do. Okay, so what happened in Canada, right, is that you had the baby boom, right? So we talked about generational cohorts not last time, but a few classes ago when we were talking about socialization, right? You had this big generational cohort called the baby boomers, right? They start, the oldest ones are born around 1945, so mid to late part of the 1940s, and the generational cohort kind of ends around 1962, 1963. All right, so it's a huge generational cohort, right? And what happens then is there's a lot of young men being born in that generational cohort, right? So what happens is as they start to get into that window, right, that 15 to 22-year-old window, you will see a big spike in crime, right? So, and this is kind of what we see, right? Right around the time that generational cohort really starts to enter, right? So like by 1962, right, you're getting that first part of the boomers that will be in that kind of sweet spot for crime commission amongst males. And what do you see? The crime rate starts to go up. As more of that generational cohort moves into that space, the crime rate rises. And then as that last part of that generational cohort sort of ages out of that key point in crime, right? So like the last of them born, say 1963, right? They'll be about 20 years old in 1983. So they're going to reach the end part of that kind of crime commission window for men, towards the later part of the 1980s, right? Again, it's not like at 22 people stop committing crime, it just starts to go down. So there's a little bit of lag effect, but by the end of the 1980s, that big chunk of the boomers, this very big generational cohort, is going to age out of that kind of key period of crime commission, after which point the crime rate should go down. And that's kind of precisely, if you look at that blue line and the red line, violent crime a little bit less, that's precisely what you see, right? That as that generational cohort gets into its, mid-20s, the crime rate starts to go down and declines overall from there. Right, so this has led a lot of people to say that basically what was happening is, I'll answer that question in a sec. As that generational cohort, gets older, crime declined, right? And what happened afterwards, right, in Canada was, and the US is the same, right? The next generation that followed was Generation X. And Generation X, for a lot of cultural reasons, is a very small generational cohort, much smaller than the baby boomers. And so they wouldn't have had an equal kind of effect on crime rising, right? Because they were such a small part of the population that as they got into those kind of crime committing years, right, kind of, I guess, 64. So by like 1984, they're kind of coming into it, but they're so small as a cohort that they're not ultimately able to replace, the people committing crimes, right? So you wouldn't see them kind of in that trend line that's too small of a generational cohort. And like Canada, generally speaking, has sort of what we would call an upside down demographic structure, right? Where Canada is very kind of heavy with kind of retirees so people at the top of the kind of age scale, and has a relatively small youth population given the total size of the population, right? And it's something like by the 2030s, somewhere between a quarter and a third of all Canadians will be kind of retirement age. So we have a really weird demographic structure, which means, the crime rate's going to be smaller because there's just less young people to commit crime. And for whatever reason, crime is a young person's game. Oh, spasiba большое. It says, I'm the best professor ever in the world, I guess. Best professor in the world. I think that was a test. I was like, can you really speak and read Russian? A little bit. But anyway, someone was testing me. It's like, I don't believe you. Well, believe me now. Okay, so why don't we see more crimes from elderly people who have less to lose? Okay, now this is an interesting question, which I'll try not to dwell on for too long. Both of you. Well, to assume people will be able to retire. Hey, you see my TFSA, it's not looking pretty. Okay, let's not assume that you're the only one that can speak Russian. I cleared a question I shouldn't have. Okay, bold to assume people will be able to retire. Look, if my TFSAs are any indication, I will never be able to retire. So I'm not assuming anything. I'm sorry I cleared your question. Why don't we see more crime from elderly people who have way less to lose? You're assuming wrong. Actually, elderly people have much more to lose than young people. Elderly people are probably not wanting to spend their final years in prison, right? The older you are, the less likely you are to get out. And as you get older, right, you're actually more kind of socially bonded, right? So you have a job, you have children, you have, relationships you care about, maybe a spouse, right? So you actually have much more to lose than someone who's 17, right? Who is like, they don't have deep social commitments, right? Their, friends and family might not die while they're in prison, right? Actually, young people have much less to lose in a lot of cases. Also, here's the other thing. The human brain. I have to give some kudos to psychology now and then, even though I'm loath to do so. One of the things we've learned about the human brain, right, is that the prefrontal cortex, the thinky part, right? That's really good science there, Broussard. The part that actually controls higher reasoning, and especially things like understanding the long-term consequences of your action, prefrontal cortex, doesn't fully form until you are about 25, right? By about 25, then your brain's fully formed. So this is why, like, when anyone suggests that teenagers should be allowed to make any kind of life decisions, I more or less scoff. I'm like, no, your brain is stupid. Stop it. Like, your brain doesn't understand long-term consequences. You cannot think long-term consequences to your teenager. It's actually in the structures of the brain. So no, let's not give teenagers the ability to vote. That's a terrible idea. I don't even think 18-year-olds should be allowed to vote, frankly. I was 18 and I did vote, so that's my old person privilege now. Anyway, my views on young people. It's like, maybe when you're 40, you should be allowed to vote. I don't know, I'm kidding now. But right, like, so young people also, right, they're much less able to judge kind of long-term consequences because the brain hasn't fully developed, especially in that long-term thinking kind of aspect, right? This is why teenagers are so impulsive, right? This is why teenagers will like pleasure seek to a great extent, because that long-term thinking is not well developed. Older people have less socialization because they don't. Who the fuck? I'm sorry. Who the fuck taught you that? Like, that's complete bullshit. Okay. In terms of social bonds, all right, I'm thinking of it like a sociologist. Maybe, yeah, that older people act more recklessly. Oh, come on. I'm sorry. That's not true. Psych 105. That's what you get for trusting psychologists. Like, I'll tell you all sorts of things that aren't true. Older people have less socialization because they don't want to socialize with too many people who irritate them. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'm sorry. That's a joke, right? No, seriously? Okay, that's not true. You're much more deeply kind of integrated into kind of social networks as you're older, right? Like when you get really elderly, yes, a lot of people you know have died, but that's like way at the end of the window. Like in adulthood, like through into your 40s, 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you're deeply ingrained in kind of social networks, right? And yeah, like you're not going to go out maybe to the club and party because you're old and Cardi B sucks and you don't want to be at the club. Um, but you're much less likely to put your social bonds at risk, right? We'll talk about this when we talk some more of the Crim theories. Oh, old people don't care about what they say because they don't care anymore. Okay. I mean, yeah, that's true. Old people are opinionated, but they're not, they will rant and rave, but they're not going to go knock over a liquor store. There's a qualitative difference in these two things. Yes, they don't care, and they probably don't care about your opinion, but they also aren't going to do things that put their social bonds at risk, right? Like they want to see their grandchildren and their children, right? They want to have these deep kind of connections with them, and they don't put those bonds at risk. They have money, right? They're working. They have kind of social bonds, and they don't put those things at risk in the same way as teenagers do, who have far less social bonds. And any psychologist who tells you otherwise can come fight me in the quad at 4:00. Pistols at 4. No, I'm kidding. No, classic duel. Well, we'll get those. I think we have a museum on campus. Maybe it has some of those old-timey like front-load pistols. So pistols at 4. This guy can be my second. This is not. That's just. I can't. That's just. I'm sorry. It's incorrect. It's incorrect. Oh my God, psychology. Stop it. Would older people commit more white-collar crimes or corporate crimes? All right. I'm sorry. I've gotten off track again. So it's dawn of social justice. Yeah, I'll get my 4-year-old's Batman costume and see what we can do here. All right. Anyway. I will say this. The bulk of crime data suggests that what your psych prof says is stupid, and that person is also stupid because they went in. Slava Ukraini. Okay. Хорошо. So, glory to Ukraine. That's what they're saying there. All right. I think I've cleared this question with my silly dance. Okay. Let's talk about other weird theories. All right. Economic conditions favored a decrease in crime. Right. All right. So there's basically the case here is that, particularly starting in the 1960s, the economy, that post-war boom that happened after the Second World War, right, where Europe and Japan and the Soviet Union had destroyed themselves, right? There's nothing left of the other major economies. So Canada and the US were producing things for the rest of the world. There's this prolonged economic boom, like from 1945 up until kind of the beginning of the 1970s, but by the late 1960s, it's already cooling, right? And it's harder for people to find jobs. If people can't find jobs, right, this is kind of strain theory, which we'll talk about. They're going to, commit crimes, right? Sorry, now the Russians got me thinking, like, could I say something provocative in Russian? I could start singing the song Takova Kak Putin, how these two girls sing about how they want a man like Putin. But let's not go there. I think I know the lyrics. I don't know why. Takova Kak Putin, polnowa sil. Takova Kak Putin, on ne pil. Takova Kak Putin, что не обижал. Anyway, I can also sing the entire Russian national anthem on demand if you want me to, but probably not the point of this class. I had to learn it when I was learning Russian. So, all right. So that was economic conditions. All right, the last one. This is probably the most controversial one. This is sometimes called the Freakonomics argument of crime decline. Why? Because it was in the book Freakonomics. And basically it is that with the legalization of abortion, a lot of the young men who would have been born into lower socioeconomic classes, who would typically be the men that commit more crime, would then not be born, right? So their mothers aborted them, and therefore they were never born. So because they were never born, they could never commit crimes, right? So the legalization of abortion actually is the thing that caused the crime rate to decline. Now, I mean, there are a few problems with this argument, right? In that, like, if you look at the data for the United States, the time sink is a little bit off, right? So abortion isn't legalized in the United States until 1973. So the time sink ends up being and the really, like, the actual number of abortions, if you look at how many abortions happen, doesn't really hit its kind of high point until considerably later than that. And so, there's a bit of you should actually see, the effects, if I remember the argument, of kind of declines in kind of crime happening later than it actually happened, right? It should actually be well into the end part of the 1990s rather than when it actually happened. The other thing is, like, other countries saw similar declines in crime at similar times, but let's say like Canada actually legalized abortion considerably later than the United States did. And so, the timing effect of the abortion argument somewhat works for the US. It doesn't work for Canada, and then other places as well. It doesn't work for the kind of timing. I'm like, of these explanations, I'm prone to believe that it's a combination of causes 1 and 2, maybe with a little bit of 3, and I don't really buy the fourth one, the Freakonomics argument. Okay. Why do I know the lyrics? I don't know. It was a funny song when it came out in, like, the early 2000s. It was kind of funny that these girls were singing about how much they liked Putin, and it was hilarious. So I listened to it a few times and I learned the lyrics. Me versus Dr. Wong. That's possible. I don't know Dr. Wong. I will take him down though. Flyers for the duel, yes. Okay, I think that's saying, like, I need to work on my accent. I'm sorry. All right. Okay, when legalization of anything caused less crime, like when they legalized weed, the crime rate went down. I mean, we wouldn't really see that. Like when they legalized weed, potentially, right? But that doesn't, weed wasn't legalized until what, like 2018, 2017? I don't remember the exact year. So it's not even in our kind of, it's not even in our kind of timeline. You got distracted by my Russian singing. Okay, I'm sorry. The economics point, basically, right? Economic conditions got worse kind of from the late 1960s to the 1989 about. After which point, the economy got better. So people would have committed more crimes because there was less economic opportunity. After 1989, the economy improves and is good for about 20 years. And then, crime would have gone down. Again, this doesn't actually necessarily understand, like, why crime didn't then jump up as at the end of the 1990s, economic conditions got worse. But, neither here nor there. Come on, guys. I swear in class all the time. There's nothing special. All right. Decades, years you're mentioning. No, you don't have to worry about the decades. I won't ask that specifically. Okay. So, criminal profiles. What do criminals look like? They look like the Southside Surfers from Riverdale. No, I'm kidding. I will say that I watched that entire series except for the last episode. And for whatever reason, I just couldn't do the last episode because it got too absurd somehow after all that. All right, so 2015 criminal court cases, roughly, and when we talk about adults, right, 80% of the people that went to court in 2013, 2014 were male, 20% were female. In youth court, the split is a little bit less severe, right? It's only 74% male versus 26% female. But basically what you see, right, is that males commit far more crime than females do. That's consistent across, every demographic category, right, that we measure, right? Males always commit more crime. Males are considerably less risk averse than females on kind of average. They're more aggressive, and especially like if you talk about like top end of the bell curve, where you find like the most aggressive people in society, it's a vast majority of them are male. And the more aggressive you are, the more likely you are to commit crime. Same thing with risk aversion, right? The least risk averse people, if you look at that end of the bell curve for least, I guess it should be over here, least risk averse. So people most likely to take risks, they're like 96% male, right? So males much more likely to commit crimes than females, much more likely to commit violent crimes and all sorts of things. So we see a huge split in terms of who commit crimes. More males commit crimes than females. Okay, flicker. Okay, racial bias in the Canadian justice system. Yeah, I mean, so this has been kind of long, and especially when we talk about conflict theory, right? One of the arguments that conflict theorists make is that there is a really strong bias in the criminal justice system, in Canada and in the US, against kind of racial and ethnic minorities, particularly racial minorities, right? Okay, so when we look at the kind of percentages of who ends up in prisons in Canada, right, Indigenous people, right, make up less than 5% of Canada's population, yet make up more than 25% of the total inmate population. And depending where you are, these numbers can get really skewed in one direction or another, right? So if you're looking at, say, Manitoba, it's something like, I can't remember if that's the problem. So it's about 80% of the prison population is Indigenous, right? And though they don't represent 80% of the total population. So different parts of Canada, have different kinds of representations of Indigenous people. The prairie provinces tend to have larger Indigenous populations and much higher percentages of their incarcerated people are Indigenous. Canada's Black population, right, only about 3%. Yet they're 10% of the prison population, and higher than that if you go to Ontario, where really large communities of Black people live. Okay, especially like the GTA, right, around Toronto, that's sort of like big cluster for Black people in Canada, and we see in Ontario a much higher percent of Black people in the prison population than what's represented by their kind of total percent of the population. Yeah, between 2007 and 2016, the overall prison population in Canada jumped 5%. The number of Indigenous people increased 39%. Black people went up 42%, but Caucasians, so white people, declined by 14%. And so this has led, people who do like critical race kind of justice studies to ask, like, what's going on, right? Did white people simply stop committing crimes in Canada? Or is something else happening, right? Is it the justice system has started targeting these people, Indigenous and Black people much more? Okay, so why do certain populations, right? So, I mean, if we're talking Canada, we're talking about Indigenous and Black people principally. If we're talking about the US, right, we're more talking about Black people and, Hispanic people being, the chief people who end up in kind of incarceration. So why? Well, I mean, one of the key explanations has been poverty, right? Indigenous people and Black people in Canada are far more likely, on average, to be poor than their Caucasian peers. In the U.S., right, Blacks and or Black people and Hispanics are much more likely to be poor than white people, except in certain parts of the country, right? Like Appalachia. There's very poor white people there too. But on the whole, if you look at them comparatively across populations, Black people and Hispanic people in the US far more likely to be poor. The types of crime, and I think someone asked a question about white collar crime that I didn't answer on the slide. But regardless, right, the types of crime committed, if we look at Indigenous people in Canada and Black people, they're much more likely to commit what are called street-level crimes, right, or street crimes that are far more visible than, say, something like white-collar crimes, right? So white people, especially kind of middle class, might be more likely to commit white-collar crimes, which is like embezzling from your company, stealing from a business that you're working for, fraud, hacking, these kinds of things. Whereas, breaking into a car, mugging, drug dealing, drug offenses are all street level crimes, and they're the kinds of crimes that poor minority populations tend to engage in more often. These are also the kinds of crimes that are more aggressively policed by street level policing, right? Because there's police there catching you breaking into a house, breaking into a car, selling drugs on a street corner, mugging people, etc., etc. And so, yeah, much more likely that you're going to get caught doing those kinds of crimes. And because certain populations tend to those crimes more, you're going to get more of those people getting caught by the criminal justice system. Discrimination by the criminal justice system, right? Like this is the argument about racial profiling that police have, for years, racially profiled certain groups. So they're more likely to do things like, this was the case in New York City. And I mean, it happens in Edmonton, it happens in Toronto too. It has a slightly different name. But New York City had this very famous policy called stop and frisk, right? Where basically officers were empowered by the NYPD to, if they thought someone looked suspicious, for whatever reason, they could stop that person, question them, and then if they found probable cause, they could pat down that person and check their ID and run it against any existing warrants, right? So that was called stop and frisk, right? So stop and frisk was particularly aimed at catching people with weapons and drugs, right? So, the police would stop anyone they felt like, question them, and if they found probable cause, they would pat them down. Now, probable cause for police is extraordinarily easy to establish, right? They just have to have a good reason to think you might have committed a crime or that you might have evidence of a crime on you. As long as you can establish some vague sense of probable cause, like you heard something, you smelled something, in their pants, something was kind of, they were wearing cargo pants and that one cargo pocket is kind of bulgy. Maybe there's a bag of weed in there. That's all you really need as a police officer for probable cause. And so, when we look at what happened with stop and frisk, right, even though I think it's like 12% of the population of New York City is black, black people were stopped half the time in stop and frisk. And I can't remember I have it somewhere, but I can't remember the percentages for Hispanic people. It was something similar, right? They're a small percentage of the total population of New York, but they were stopped a large number of times compared to that population. And not surprisingly here, white people were targeted less. Now we see this in Toronto too, right? There's a policy that the Toronto Metro Police had called carding, where they would stop people and check their IDs. And, if they could establish probable cause, they could search them, right? And this targeted particularly black young men in Toronto. So we've had what they call racial profiling or discriminatory policies around policing. And obviously Indigenous people face this as well. All right, so that's that one. And then why is there this bias? Racial profiling. And then weakened social control over community members due to, so this is specifically for Indigenous people, right? The damage to Indigenous culture caused by colonialism means that there's a lot of kind of social dislocation, lack of connection, and things like intergenerational trauma that might lead to more social breakdown and commission of crimes. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop answering questions in Russian. So basically, yes, it is crazy how many people in this class apparently speak Russian. It's only like something like 400 million people in the world speak Russian, right? So how could there be 3 in this room? My God. All right, it's a factor in overrepresentation in terms of overrepresentation in terms do with direct visibility, but the presence of police in minority communities. Okay, I mean, that's an interesting question. This is an interesting question in the sense that, like, this has been one of the arguments that the NYPD actually made in favor of stop and frisk, was that, they used a system called CompStat, computational statistics, where they calculated where crime was happening in the city, and they deployed officers in those areas specifically, and those just happened to be minority areas, right? They say it's not our fault. It's not our fault that crimes are happening in these areas, and we responded to the statistics and therefore ended up arresting more minority people or stopping them in stop and frisk, right? That's been an argument people have used for things like stop and frisk and the way it was deployed. But yeah, more presence of police in minority communities. But that police will say, well, we're there more because there's more crime, right? That's been the kind of counter argument. Okay. Relating to your point about males and risk aversion, is that why women typically live longer? Yes. Have you ever seen I think it's either a Twitter page or a Reddit page, why women live longer, and it's literally just a collection of GIFs of men doing incredibly stupid things. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Nature actually knows this, right? That's why if you look at like a natural population, the birth rate for men is somewhere between 51 and 52% of all births. And so all children conceived is about 52% of them are male and 48% female, because nature knows that about 2% of males are going to die. You know. Okay. Oh, so systemic racism is why. Okay. Why did it increase? I mean, the argument is that policing became more aggressive in that period around those particular things. And then, things like the success of stop and frisk at lowering crime in New York City, which it did. Well, okay, did it? It might not have. It might have been a concurrent kind of drop in crime. But the argument is it lowered crime in New York City, especially from like the 1990s forward. And then people started copying that approach. So that probably is why. The 13th. Okay, good to know. A lot of time, people with money will be let go because they can pay off their sentences because of reputation. Yes, rich people can afford better lawyers. That is also true. Reaganomics is largely responsible for the boom in incarceration in American black people. Yeah, that's a whole different argument. Giuliani's policies didn't work well. Yeah, there's a real argument around that. But anyway, okay, all right, let's keep going. Because, I could answer your questions all day, and I do love it, but trying to get enough content for the second midterm is always a challenge. Okay, so deviant behavior, right? So how do people learn deviant behavior, right? There's real arguments about how people become deviant. And, people like symbolic interactionists in particular will suggest that criminal behavior is actually a learned behavior, right? That basically, you learn to become deviant by hanging around other deviant people. And almost every model of how young, like I know this because I taught classes on this, like youth crime in society, so 321, how young people move into deviance, almost all of them have to do with either antisocial socialization by parents or antisocial socialization by already deviant peers, right? So one of the things that a lot of models of kind of crime prevention for young people have focused on is how do we stop people from becoming socialized into deviance? Because we know like people aren't necessarily deviant to begin with. They become deviant by interacting with particular people. All right, so here's the classic study of this is Howard S. Becker's 1963 study of marijuana users and how they learned to love the bong, if you will. Sorry, a little joke for you there. If you got deep Stanley Kubrick vibes, how I learned to love the bong. Okay, basically, one of the things that Becker kind of looked at was that, most people approaching sort of marijuana and drug use, they did so kind of cautiously, right? Because it has a lot of social stigmas associated with it. And so most people are not like dying to, become marijuana users, or they weren't in 1963. Now there's a weed store every 4.5 feet, so it's a little different. At least in Alberta. I swear, they just build more of them. It's like liquor store, marijuana store, liquor store, marijuana store, liquor store, marijuana. It's like, do you want us to be alcoholic weed users? Is that what society's telling me? Anyway, so learning to smoke the drug, was a process where people learned to enjoy this form of deviance. So basically, he sort of identified it in 3 stages, right? So learning to smoke the drug in a way that produces real effects, right? That people would hang around other people who were smoking marijuana, and those people would show them kind of the culture around marijuana, right? How to roll a joint, how to use a bong, how to inhale and hold the smoke in such a way that you would, maximize how high you got from it. That basically this was the way that people, learned how to, so you don't just take little puffs and then start coughing, like you just sucked on the tailpipe of a car. Everything I've seen people learning to smoke has been like, the first one is not that pleasant, right? So people teach you how to inhale it so you don't, hack up your left lung. And how you maximize kind of the amount of, substance that gets into your bloodstream. Okay. The second one was learning to recognize the effects and connect it with the drug, right? People would tell you, right? They would narrate like, okay, like this is what now you've taken a few hits. This is what you're going to be feeling now, right? Like this is what the experience of using marijuana is like. And then learning to enjoy the perceived sensation rather than feeling like panicked or worried about the altered mental state that it causes, right? People would be relaxed into that state by other people who knew what it was like and had explained it to them. And this is how people learned how to smoke marijuana, right? And probably that person was bringing like Cheetos or something, or pizza, so that the person could, when they got the munchies, they didn't go crazy. They just, learned to enjoy the smoking and snacking that goes along with marijuana. Okay, so that's kind of how, a symbolic interactionist looks at how people acquire drug behavior. But even if we look at crime, right? How do people get socialized into doing crime? Well, they hang around with other people who are deviant. Those people teach them how to commit crimes. They teach them how not to get caught. They teach them what to do and what not to do, potentially when they do get caught, right? And so, how do you break into a car? How do you do all these things? It's a socialization process, right? So yeah, like I said, almost every model of like crime prevention in young people is like, how do we keep them away from other people committing crimes, right? And that's, basically at its core. So basically learning any deviant or criminal role requires some kind of social context, which, experienced deviants teach novices like the tricks of the trade. The more exposure to experience of deviants and criminals increases the chance that you'll become deviant or criminal, right? And this, for example, is why, say in Canada, we have what's called the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And a big part of the Youth Criminal Justice Act is what's called diversion, or the don't put young people in prison kind of philosophy. Why? Because prison is where criminals learn to do more crime. Because you put a bunch of people who've committed crimes together in prison, they swap stories, they form social bonds between criminals, and what you get is more criminality out of it. So, don't do that if you want crime to go down. I still got too many minutes to let you all go, even though I see people leaving. All right, I know, we're far away from everything. I'm kidding. So, all right, so labeling theory. Labeling theory basically says that deviance is not so much that an act in itself is deviant, right? But that society labels things as deviant, right? So terms like deviant and criminal are not automatic, right? They're not automatically applied to people who violate rules. Only in certain circumstances are things labeled as deviant, right? And this can change over time, right? Symbolic interactionists love to be like, we can redefine things over time. And that's what they think about deviance and crime too. Something that is considered deviant today may not be considered deviant tomorrow. Something like smoking marijuana, which would have been super deviant in 1970, today is considered not deviant at all. Why? Because it's legal, right? And it's a relatively normal social activity. Things get applied labels of deviant or criminal, but these things can change, right? And we've seen this even around things like sex work, right? Where, someone who is a provider of sex work services, it used to be, seen as deeply deviant, but there's been an ongoing kind of social effort to, they would say destigmatize sex work, but really it's removing the label of deviance from sex work, right? And that's what symbolic interactionists think you can do, because nothing is deviant in and of itself, according to interactionists. It's only so because we label it as such. Hey, it worked well for me. Wouldn't labeling theory fall under social constructionism? Yes, because symbolic interactionism and social constructionism are together. So yes, you are right. Okay, yeah, interactionists focus typically on learning and labeling when it comes to deviant and criminal roles. Functionalists tend to look more at the social dysfunctions that lead to deviant and criminal behavior, right? So a functionalist is going to say, okay, what social institution has broken down that would lead someone to committing a crime, right? So when we see something like an economic argument for deviance, right? Oh, people are committing crime because of poverty or lack of opportunity in jobs, you're then into the realm of a functionalist argument. Why? Because they're saying like this unit of society, this social institution that we shall call the economy, has broken down and isn't serving people, and so they have no choice but to commit crimes. I love this picture so much. Oh, Durkheim, you put the fun in functionalism. All right, Durkheim and his controversial claim. Durkheim actually said that deviance and crime are, in a sense, beneficial for society, that they serve an important social purpose. And it was specifically this. When someone commits a crime, when they break a rule, it gives people a chance to condemn and punish them, right? Now, what does that do, right? A, punishing people is fun. No, I'm kidding. It can be. See, now I'm sounding a little bit dominatrixy, but anyway, I swear I'm not. Punishing people can be fun, though. One of the great reasons to have children is to punish them. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's a terrible joke. I shouldn't make it. I'll edit it out of the video later. But it gives people a chance, it gives society a chance to reaffirm its boundaries, right? To clarify it, right? If someone steals something and you know, let's say we're in medieval society, and you put them in the stocks, right? That little thing where you stick their head and their two hands through, and people get to throw fruit at them and vegetables, rotten ones, right? That gives people a chance to know what those boundaries are, right? When a famous person is put on trial, or a trial gets a lot of attention in the court or in the newspapers, right? For someone stealing, right, a Bernie Madoff for his pyramid schemes, or someone murders someone and we put them on trial for it, and it's, you know, huge publicity around it. Durkheim would say that crime is beneficial to society because it allows us all to reaffirm where the boundaries are, right? Don't steal, don't kill, don't, whatever it happens to be. It lets us know what the rules are, what the kind of moral boundaries are in a society, and then can result in positive social change. Because if those boundaries are reaffirmed, people can align their behavior with those norms and values in serious ways. Okay, that's it. I can't do string theory in 1 minute. Have a great weekend. We'll see you. I did another 15 slides today, even the Russian joking aside, so it's all good. Yes?
I emailed you last time for rescheduling my lecture, and you told me to email you again.
Okay, hang on, let me shut this microphone off so not everyone has to hear what I'm saying. Okay, let me just find it.
Someone dropped their art card.
I don't know what to do with this. Is there a way to know whose it is?
I don't know. I found it over there.
All right, I'm going to leave it here, and hopefully they find it. Okay, hang on. Let me just disconnect this and turn off the...